Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Flat Earth Research Fails. Today I'm going to take a look at the claim that people make about how rocketry has been the only technology in the world that has gone backwards with time. This claim stems out of one of the Flat Earthers' favorite pastimes, that it's cherry picking and taking things like to mean what best suits their narrative. So in this case, we're of course talking about the astronauts saying that the technology to go to the moon was destroyed and that we cannot do it anymore. While true that we cannot go there anymore, it doesn't mean that technology has gone backwards. It just means that the priorities have changed and the new technology has a different purpose in mind. So before I get into this, two disclaimers. One, I want to apologize to all those moon landing deniers that are not flat earthers, because yes, I'm bunching you up with the crazy of crazy. And I've met a few flat earthers, not flat earthers, moon landing deniers in my life that they're not scientifically inclined, let's say. They just saw one of the claims that sound more or less plausible, like the non-parallel shadows, or the fact that yes, we haven't been there in 50 years, and they're like, okay, yeah, that sounds fair enough, and they didn't give much thought about it. However, from my experience when reading comments, the normal moon landing denier that you find in YouTube comment sections and doing research in quotation marks tends to be a flat earther. Because usually when you are more or less sane and you start looking into the evidence, you see like, okay, yeah, actually it seems quite likely there's good explanation for the discrepancies in quotation marks again, and it ends up being far more likely that we went to the moon that they were able to fake it, especially since the one good answer as to why they would fake it is to beat the Russians, and it also means, well, the Russians had the technology to know if it was faked. So in the end, it would have been better to just go there. My second disclaimer is that this in no way is going to be a proof that the moon landings happened. I'm just going to show how this claim made by conspiracy theorists is just wrong. Okay, so first let's take a look at what the technology was at the time as far as spacefaring. So from left to right, the first four we have where the rockets used to go just in space above Earth. And so the Mercury capsule with a Redstone rocket that could not even achieve orbit, still Mercury capsule with the Atlas rocket could put one man in orbit, Gemini capsule on board the Titan rocket, which could put two people in orbit, and also do spacewalks and docking. Then the Apollo 1 that could put the Apollo spacecraft and the landing module in low Earth orbit, and was used to test all the technology on Earth before going to the moon. And then of course you have the Saturn V. Now, one of the first things to notice is to see the huge size discrepancy in the Saturn V compared to the Saturn 1. And it's because, yeah, going to the moon takes fuel, and the main problem with manned space flight is that you also need fuel to bring them back. You also need to put supplies, and you need extra fuel to take those supplies and the extra fuel to the moon. And that's the thing with spaceflight, and it's going to become a theme that everywhere you can save in mass is good, because it tends to accumulate quite a bit. Like, okay, you need a fuel to get back from the moon. Well, you need extra fuel to take that fuel to the moon, and you need more extra fuel to bring all that extra fuel from Earth's surface into orbit. Unfortunately, since the percentage of mass that is made up of fuel in a rocket is quite high, doubling the amount of fuel does not double the delta V, which is like the mileage of a rocket, in the same way that it would if you double the amount of fuel in the car, because now you have a lot more fuel to push along. Okay, I'm going to stop saying fuel for now. So first off, let's see what was so special about the technology to go to the moon compared to the rest of the technology to just be in low Earth orbit. Well, there honestly wasn't that much. The extra challenges were getting to the moon and also protecting against radiation, which I know there's a lot of people that are going to be saying that in the comments. Now, unfortunately, I'm not a radiation expert or a material science expert. I don't know how much better the Apollo spacecraft radiation shielding was compared to the Gemini. However, I do know two things. One, that they didn't spend a lot of time in the radiation belts, which, if you've been around in this subject, you know too, and if you claim you don't know, you're just in denial. Like, it has been answered quite a bit. The other thing is that radiation is as far as exposure and also exposure time. So being a really long time in a low radiation environment can be quite more harmful than being a short period of time in a medium radiation environment. And the reason I say this is because today we constantly have astronauts spending a lot of time in a low radiation environment, which is low Earth orbit. Sure, the Valenian island belts protect us from most of the radiation, but some of it still goes through. And, well, even here on the surface of the Earth, we get some radiation. If you take several flights during your life, you're going to have a bigger radiation dose than someone who never flew. And low Earth orbit, even more. So if you compare the amount of radiation you get from a 6-month mission in the ISS to the amount of radiation that they got in a flight to the moon, which did not last more than 2 weeks, I believe, then it's going to be a larger dose. So at least for the ISS, the radiation shielding has to be better than the Apollo spacecraft. That's really all I can say about radiation. It's not in my expertise. But well, the other thing was the actual rocket itself. Such a big rocket had to propel itself off from the ground and managed to get into orbit and get to the moon. And this is the business end. One of the great technological achievements for the Saturn V was the F1 rocket. 5 of these very, very powerful rockets managed to put not into orbit, but managed to lift the Saturn V above the main dense layers of the atmosphere, where the next engines could work more efficiently. However, this was not a very efficient engine. It was very powerful, not very efficient. The way we measure efficiency of the engines is with the ISP. The higher the ISP, the better. The F1 had an ISP of around 250, if I remember correctly. And while more efficient upper stage engines have efficiencies of 300 or 400, even 450. I want to point out at this moment that since flat earthers are so proud of their research, I decided to see if I could trump their knowledge as far as technology improvements with just things that I knew off the top of my head. So I did research numbers on these engines, but if I pull out all the numbers, I'm going to talk way too much about it. But every improvement that you will see here is something that I already knew existed. I just looked up details about it. So if you claim you've been doing a lot of research in this, you should know about this too. Anyway, the other piece of technology that was in the Saturn V were the J2 engines. Now, unlike the F1 and most engines at the time, they used to run on RP1, which is a form of kerosene, and liquid oxygen as far as oxidizer. The J2 was a hydrogen oxygen engine. These engines tend to be very efficient. They also tend to be quite expensive, and since liquid hydrogen is very low density, it means you need big tanks to hold the same amount of mass. You also need to insulate them because the boiling point of liquid hydrogen is very, very low. And it's harder to get good thrust out of them because of the low density of the liquid. You need to expel more of it to get the same amount of thrust with a certain specific impulse. So, as far as technology improvements, well, the F1 is to this day the most powerful single-chambered liquid-fueled engine that exists. Solid rocket motors tend to be more powerful, but they're in a whole different bag of technology. They have their own pros and cons. But you might say, okay, so if it's still the most powerful, then technology has not advanced much, has it? And to that I will say 2 points. First, I said it's single-chambered because the Russians were able to trump it in the 80s with the RD-170. So this was used in the Energia launcher. It was unfortunately a short-lived project since it came to be shortly before the Soviet Union fell. The Energia launcher only flew twice, once to put the Polius spacecraft into orbit and another one, the Buran. And it was actually quite a good rocket. There were no rocket failures in the 2 launches. The Polius spacecraft failed, but that was a problem with the spacecraft itself. And it had different versions, like with the Atlas V, they had a different number of boosters and everything. And the largest one could put around 180 tons to orbit, compared to the Saturn V's 140. So, had it ever flown, it would have been the largest rocket to have ever flown, but the versions used for the Polius and Buran were smaller. But yeah, here's one example of improvements as far as power. However, the priorities of space agencies in general were not so much in power, but in reducing price and efficiency, increasing efficiency, obviously. Because, as it turns out, really, really big, really powerful rockets are also really, really expensive. So, this one is, of course, very recent, relatively speaking, but as far as reducing the cost of your launcher, we have the Merlin engines. Now, this is the engine used in the Falcon 9, which we all know for watching wonderful videos of them landing back down and then seeing the comments of everybody calling them fake. So, the Merlin engine is not particularly special. It is, of course, much more efficient than the F1. I'm talking about the variant for the first stage. There's a first stage variant and a second stage variant. However, it did 2 things. It increased its complexity and still managed to be a very cheap engine to manufacture. Now, why was the complexity increased? Well, most first stage engines are designed that they cannot throttle and they cannot be reignited. The reason for this is that adding a mechanism to reignite the engine adds complexity, and also the ability to throttle adds moving parts, adds complexity, and the more complex an engine is, the more likely it is to fail. So, of course, in general, that is not desirable. When you're dealing with having humans on board, the ability to throttle starts to become desirable, because otherwise you can get very high Gs in the last few seconds of a stage if you cannot throttle down. This is the reason why the space shuttle engines throttled. But as far as the Falcon 9, well, if you can't throttle and you can't relight your engines, you're not going to land the thing. At least not if you're trying to do a propulsive landing. So yeah, they needed to go that way, and it has worked beautifully. If I remember correctly, the Falcon 9 has only had 2 failures as far as getting stuff into orbit. And in both cases there were, well, one was a problem with the strut, the other one was a problem with the tank, but never with the engines. Actually, no, I just remembered, it never had a mission-ending failure in the engines, but there was one time that one of the engines cut out. But it has 9 of them, so it can compensate. Now, I said that most improvements were geared towards making spacecraft lighter, more efficient, and also cheaper. The Falcon 9 is an example of making things cheaper, mostly through reusability, although even in expendable configuration it's cheaper than all the other rockets as far as price per kilogram of getting something into orbit. Over here we have the engines for the Delta IV rockets, and this one goes the way of efficiency. It's actually a hydrogen-oxygen engine that can generate enough thrust to lift the rocket. As said earlier, hydrogen-oxygen engines tend to have a weaker thrust than RP-1 engines, but this one they made it powerful enough so that 3 of them could lift the Delta IV Heavy, which was the largest rocket to be flying until the Falcon Heavy flew. Now, for those cherry pickers out there, I'm meaning like flying at the time. The Delta IV Heavy was in no way larger than the Saturn V. Then, a very puny entry to the market of making things more efficient is the Rutherford engine. Now, these are quite weak. Like, we're talking, while the F1 had around 7,000 kilonewtons of thrust, this one had around 25 kilonewtons. But this belongs to one of the smallest orbital rockets that exist today, which is the Electron rocket. It is still an RP-1 rocket engine. However, it actually relies on electricity to run its pumps. So most rockets use some of their fuel to run the pumps that feed the fuel into the combustion chamber. And then, though some designs do reuse that fuel, it's nowhere near as efficient. The Electron rocket decides to use an electric pump instead. It has a disadvantage that then you need quite massive batteries to run this thing, but in the end they found out that it compensated for the loss of fuel that was needed for running the turbopumps, and they came up with I think actually at some point it was considered the cheapest rocket as far as price per kilogram to low Earth orbit. Unfortunately, the Electron is too small to put most satellites into orbit. It's mainly aimed at the CubeSat market, but they've been doing quite well. Now, these, of course, have all been examples of very recent rockets, like in the last decade, from private companies. I mean, this might say, yeah, but what happened for the other 40 years? Well, look no further than the space shuttle. Now, one thing about rocket engines is that their efficiency depends on the atmospheric pressure around it. All engines will have a better specific impulse, like again the measure of efficiency, and also higher thrust in the vacuum, but some are designed that are the larger the bell, you optimize it for vacuum performance, and if you use it at sea level, it's going to have very, very poor thrust and specific impulse. While if you design an engine for sea level, it's going to have a better performance, but then the performance is not going to increase as much as it gets higher, as it would for a vacuum rated engine. So, and this is because of the shape of the nozzle. So the larger the nozzle, the lower the pressure of the exhaust gases in the rockets. And the ideal pressure for the exhaust gases is to match the atmospheric pressure around it. And that became a problem since the rockets go up and there's a pressure gradient, which we keep repeating to flat earthers. So the great thing about the space shuttle engine was that it managed to have a wide nozzle and still preventing from the atmosphere from pushing it too much against the exhaust gases while at sea level, making it a good sea level engine as well as a good vacuum engine. And that was quite important because it ran the entire way. It did not provide the most thrust at takeoff. That was the solid rocket boosters, but it still provided a good amount of delta V. So it was important for it to have a good efficiency. And as we've seen, NASA spent a lot of their research money on the space shuttle. In the end, the whole program failed, but that was more of a problem with the complexity of the orbiter than the engine itself. But that's not it. There have also been advances in making upper stage engines much more efficient than the J2, which was the one for the Saturn V. And one of the best examples is the RL-10. Now, the RL-10 was still developed in the 60s, but it has been improving over and over and over again, so it still counts. And one of the things that I'm just going to include it here because I find it's quite cool. So I just spoke about how you want a large nozzle for vacuum engines because that reduces the pressure of the exhaust gas. Now, the ideal engine for the vacuum would be one with an infinitely large nozzle, but that has some problems with putting it into practice in reality for obvious reasons. However, what you see here in the video is an extendable nozzle. So depending on some engines, if they're used still in the atmosphere, it will descend at some point. Others, it's just used when the engine turns on, the nozzle descends. And what this helps is that you can have a very large nozzle without having the very large interstage. So this will never be your first stage engine. Therefore, it means it's going to be tucked in an interstage somewhere until it's time for it to light up. If you have a very large interstage, well, more mass goes into it, and mass is bad in space. But also, you need better materials to make a large interstage that will not fail during the pressures of launch. Now, these are all engines that have flown. Unfortunately, a lot of technological advancements in rocketry end up in a warehouse somewhere because the project they were destined for lost funding, something else failed, and there's a lot of risk with trying new technology. You never know how reliable it's going to be. And when you're talking about rockets that cost millions of dollars, risk is bad. So one of the technological advancements over normal chemical rockets actually came in the 60s. It was being developed while the Apollo missions were going on. So yeah, even back then they were already improving the technology that you say has not been improving. This is the Nerva engine. It was a nuclear engine. So instead of relying on a chemical reaction to expand the gases, you basically had they were pumping hydrogen, liquid hydrogen through a nuclear reactor to heat it up, and that would cause the aggressive expansion and provided a lot of thrust. Now, this rocket could not be used in the atmosphere. It wasn't powerful enough. It was also very heavy because it carried a bloody nuclear reactor with it. However, it was meant to power a vehicle that would go bring people to Mars. So back then they were still thinking about a Mars mission. And yeah, the rocket was successfully tested. Unfortunately, eventually the program was cancelled, and it's too heavy to use on small probes, so in the end it was never used on a mission. Then you also have aerospikes. This one is the linear aerospike, and this one's actually the whole plumbing and everything, all of the entire rocket engine besides the nozzle is based on the design for the J2, but the nozzle is the important part here. So you remember how I said that the geometry of the nozzle determines how efficient it's going to be, because it determines the pressure of the exhaust gas. Well, aerospikes can modify their internal geometry as in flight, so you can have a good sea level thrust on an ISP, and then modify it to have good vacuum ISP, all like automatically. So this aerospike was actually meant to go with the VentureStar project, which was an SSTO, which is basically a rocket that can get into orbit without dropping any stages. So VentureStar was a space plane, just like the shuttle. It would take off vertically under the power of I think they used 6 aerospikes, and then come gliding back down to a runway without dropping a single piece of hardware out. Unfortunately, one of the VentureStar's tanks had problems with it. Eventually the project went over budget and it got cancelled. So as you can see, there have been a few improvements that have gone away from the chemical rocket traditional nozzle design, but they never flew. All the improvements that I have covered here that did get to fly in actual missions were still traditional nozzle chemical rocket engines. This one, however, is something completely different, and it has flown quite a few times. This is an ion engine. So ion engines work on a completely different principle, where they have a noble gas, they ionize it, and then use powerful magnets to accelerate the gas outside the engine, achieving much higher exhaust speeds than a normal chemical reaction. So this gives them extremely good efficiency. To give you an idea, the N-Star engine that was used in the Dawn mission had a specific impulse of 3,100 seconds, compared to the specific impulse of normal hydrogen-oxygen engine, such as the J2, which tended to have even the RL-10 would go to around 450 seconds of ISP, not much higher than that. Now, this means that these engines are very good for probes in interplanetary space, but of course they're not the best for human exploration, since their very low power means they only work for small probes, and they're not good for quick flights. They have exceedingly long burn times. So, for example, normally a chemical rocket, even if it's a very low thrust, very high efficiency one, it won't make burns that are longer than 10-15 minutes. While the Dawn spacecraft, I think its longest burn time was around a year and a half to encounter, I think, Ceres. It went to Ceres and Vesta, but I don't know which was the long burn. So yeah, longer missions are okay with probes, but they're not so good with people because you have to feed them for such a long time. But yeah, these have been used. It has flown on the Dawn mission. It was used for the Baby Colombo. It's going to use it to get into orbit of Mercury. It's going to take, I think, 7 different passes around Mercury because of the low thrust. And they have also been used as additive thrusters for small satellites, so that they don't use up so much fuel reorienting themselves. And one that I'm waiting very patiently from, but it's getting quite frustrating, it's the Skylon engine. This is the Sabre engine. So Skylon is an SSTO project, a British project, where it's going to be a space plane that takes off like a normal jet airplane. At some point it switches to rocket mode and gets into orbit. Now the secret to that is the Sabre engine, which can work as both a jet engine using the atmosphere and as a rocket engine using onboard oxygen. It can switch through these modes in flight, and it's also surprisingly light. So that means you have a spaceplane that can achieve orbit without dropping any stages. Now, unfortunately, the project has taken a while in development. I think back in 2010 they said that by 2017 they would be doing the first test flight. But we all know how it goes with these projects. At least I haven't heard it has been cancelled, so it's still good. So yeah, those were several examples of direct improvements to the rocket technology that took people back to the moon. And so now here, well then, was the guy that said that the technology was destroyed lying? No. I mean, first of all, it's just a video clip from an interview. He probably didn't have time to go into an entire detail on the history of rocket technology. But yeah, it is true, we don't have a rocket that can put people on the moon. And it's like, well, with this technology, why don't you? And that's because the priorities of space programs changed. As it turns out, putting people on missions that go further than low Earth orbit is quite expensive, quite dangerous, and not really that more fruitful as far as science is concerned. So, to give you an idea, here we have the Wikipedia page of the Saturn V. And if we look here, cost per launch, 185 million in money that time, so it translates to roughly 1.16 billion in 2016 dollars. Now this was to launch the rocket, just to launch the rocket. Well, of course, like build the rocket and launch it. For this particular, normally this cost doesn't include the spacecraft. I don't know if being that the Saturn V was designed for the sole purpose of putting the Apollo spacecraft into orbit, it might include that cost. So let's just say it did. Let's now compare it to the New Horizons mission, which was the one that went to Pluto. And here we have the cost of the mission, including spacecraft and instrument development, also like the research into the spacecraft, launch vehicle, mission operations, data analysis, and education/public outreach, is approximately 700 million over 15 years. These are like current dollars. That's a very big difference for a spacecraft that went all the way to Pluto, passed through another Kuiper Belt object, passed through other planets in the solar system on the way there, compared to just going to the moon. Now, I really don't want to reduce the achievement of landing people on the moon. Technologically speaking, it was a great achievement. However, scientifically speaking, it did not yield that much. There was a lot of knowledge gained from the Apollo missions, but it was technology-wise on getting the necessary technology to get people there and back safely. But we didn't learn too much from the moon itself. I mean, the reality is that the Apollo program was a giant dick measuring contest with Russia. The Russians even, to a lesser degree, matched the scientific accomplishments with the Apollo program, because they also managed to put retroreflectors on the moon with a rover, And they managed to bring back lunar samples, like from lunar soil. Now they brought a token amount compared to the, I forget, like 800 kilos that were brought in total in the Apollo missions. So yes, a rover is not able to collect nearly as much rocks and soil as a human would be, but it's still like a lot cheaper, a lot easier, and a lot less risky, obviously. That's small parentheses, another thing that you need to explain. So the Lunokhod rover, was it Lunokhod? I forgot which mission it was, but one of the Russian missions brought back samples from the moon later than 1969, I think it was 71, 72. And they match in composition to the Apollo moon missions. So if you're a normal moon landing denier that doesn't think that the entire Cold War was a hoax and that they're all in on it to hide the shape of the Earth, you probably need to also explain how NASA managed to fake moon rocks that were identical to the Russian ones without actually having been able to analyze lunar samples before. Because I don't think any rover or any probe brought back lunar samples as far as NASA. So yeah, it basically boils down to the fact that after the moon missions, there really was no interest in sending people further away. Sending people all the way to Mars requires a huge stride in technology that just did not happen. Also, establishing a more permanent base on the moon was quite hard, so there was really no point in keep sending them people to the moon. They weren't going to learn anything new. So they canceled the project. Of course, all the manufacturers of the parts repurposed their machinery, because it's building a rocket is not that simple. In building a rocket engine, you're going to need a very big machinery that occupies space. If you're no longer going to use it, then you change it for a different engine. And so this is how the technology was destroyed. I've also heard some people mention that because the blueprints for the Saturn V do exist, like all the design is still there. I've heard some people that say that there were some handmade details that went into the engines that were not in the original blueprints, and those people who did it have died now. I don't really know much about this claim, but let's assume everything was written down. You would still need to bring up all the machinery, all the requirements to build a Saturn V. You would also have to repurpose one of the launch pads in Cape Canaveral, because each rocket has a special launch pad for it. You can't just swap rockets around like in KSP. So yeah, technically we could build another Saturn V, but like that guy said, it would be a painful process. Painful, costly, and not worth it. In the end, it would not be able to achieve something else than what the Apollo missions already did. And then you might say, well, but since you already ran through all these new improvements, why don't they just bunch them up together into a better rocket? Not as easy as it sounds. It turns out it's what's happening with the SLS. They're using the rocket engines from the space shuttle to make a rocket that could go to the moon. Now, even some people think that this project should be cancelled, that the technology is already a bit obsolete. It's still from the shuttle 80s. But building a rocket is not as simple as just sticking a bunch of engines at the bottom of a fuel tank, like you would imagine from playing KSP. I love the educational value of KSP as far as orbital mechanics, but as far as rocket engineering, nope, it's not like that. And the Russians found out about this the hard way. The N-1 rocket, which was Russia's lunar rocket, was basically they took a a very good engine. The NK engines were quite good, and very sought after, I think, up to this day. They took a bunch of these, I think in the end it was 32, and just stuck them under a very big tank. And that was the N1 rocket. It had a lot more thrust than the Saturn V, but it turns out that no matter how good your engine is, when you have 32 of them, the vibrations just wreck them. It was even over-engineered that it could have up to 6 engines fail and still reach orbit. But the vibrations just called way more than 6 engines to suddenly start failing, and in 4 launches they all failed spectacularly, and the project was cancelled. So yeah, in the end, there have been technological improvements. Most have been towards unmanned missions because it's safer and cheaper and more reasonable, more productive scientifically, and yeah, unfortunately, it just means that some astronauts don't get to go to the moon. Hopefully we will be going back sometime soon, and the European Space Agency is working on plans for a permanent moon base, so that would actually be like a worthwhile scientific endeavor. But technologically it's much harder than the Apollo missions, so these things take time. Anyway, I hope you found this video interesting. If you had heard this claim and were thinking, yeah, that sounds ridiculous, I hope you realize that now it is, because it's not true. And, well, just say thank you for watching, and I think at this point I have run out of ideas on what to do, but I'm sure a few nights of going through some comments in YouTube sections will bring out new ridiculous claims that have just not been addressed because of the sheer amount of ridiculous claims that usually get spouted by flat earthers. Okay, thanks again for watching, and see you later.